So welcome back to the Confidence in Cloud for IT Professional session. In this fourth and last module, we're going to look at the Canadian legislative landscape for cloud computing. That's a mouthful for me.
It certainly is a mouthful for me as well. As a simple engineer, not a legal professional, it is a challenge.
So maybe in post we can put a little disclaimer here. It says we are not lawyers.
That's
Seek
right.
advice from your own legal department.
Always seek advice from your own legal department. And where we found cloud computing being successful, it's where you bring the whole organization together, representatives from the whole organization for a conversation.
Business units,
Legal, risk, compliance, and the C-suite.
and the C-suite.
And the
And
IT
IT.
professional.
So if you've got 6 fingers on one hand, you're there. So we're going to take a look at the challenge within the country: security, privacy certification within our geography, legal environment and policies,
That's right.
without making any interpretation,
That's exactly right.
and additional safeguards, privacy analytics, and so on. So, John, what is the challenge?
Well, when we start talking about cloud computing, one of the things that comes front and center is perceptions of the law or interpretations of the law. And one of the first conversations that I often have is that, hey, there's a misperception that organizations in Canada are prohibited from using international cloud services.
A lot of my customers always tell me that. No, I can't use it because I'm not allowed to put data in the cloud.
And I'm not really sure how that perception has evolved. I know that there are some legislative requirements that require additional safeguards, and certainly this is not unique to Canada. When we look internationally even, that there are particular requirements or obligations about how you safeguard information. So this is no different than looking at handling credit card information and the payment card industry, of what they oblige people that handle credit card information to do. There are some safeguards and expectations of what organizations need
And
to
compliance.
do. And compliance.
So, for example, if you're still running Windows 2003 with the credit card payment industry, once it goes out of service or out of support, you will no longer be compliant.
That's right. And so what we ask our customers to do is to do that double click. So it's not to come forward and project what they believe that the requirements are. It's to actually have that conversation. And through our experience in working with customers across the region, we found that there are some special considerations for organizations in Canada. So in British Columbia, there's legislation that has specific obligations for those handling personal information on behalf of the government. And it's important to note that that is a very small subset of the information that gets processed in that province. Nova Scotia has similar legislation. We have an institution that governs the financial institutions in Canada. It's called the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions. They've drafted some guidelines for outsourcing, and they've included cloud services in that outsourcing. And they've said, here are some types of information that should not be put within the cloud. So material information should be maintained in Canada. We've seen financial institutions across the country interpret those legislations, and they felt comfortable in moving to the cloud. So after a second review, after going in that detailed compliance review, they felt that, hey, they are comfortable that they are permitted to move to the cloud. And it's interesting, I've actually seen in some provinces where organizations that have nothing to do with governments or with the financial institutions believe that one of these laws applies to them. And it really requires that additional review and that compliance review, that compliance check. So have your legal team and your risk team go through and see what applies to your particular business.
So it's not really I can't put my information on the cloud. It's more of I can put my information on the cloud as long as I've done A, B, and C.
That's correct. Or how can I best put my information in the cloud? What are the safeguards that I need to put on the service to do that? And you'll find that in the Microsoft Enterprise Cloud services that there are some safeguards that you can make use of. Things like data loss prevention within our Office 365 that allows you to prevent people from sharing credit card numbers in the clear throughout email. Tools like that help you gain that confidence and meet your compliance requirements.
So on the technical end, it's more like a pattern recognition type of deal, and if it shows the pattern of the credit card number, we'll actually block it.
Exactly. Well, it'll provide a notice, and you can set that by policy. Provide a notice of whether or not you block it or whether or not you have to place protection like rights management on top of the service. And so once we overcome this first objection, because often people don't want to change the status quo, so they'll raise this legal.
Because the status quo is comfortable.
You're exactly right. And people don't want to leave their comfort level. And so this blocker, this objection, often gets people to keep comfortable within their environment.
So how do we keep getting comfortable?
Well, as we've gone across a number of many organizations in Canada, we found that they all have really 9 things that they do in common, 9 consistent steps to getting comfortable in the use of the cloud. And so the first step is being very, very specific. So we talked in an earlier section around cloud being a general term for a variety of online services. When we want to get comfortable in the cloud, we need to be very, very specific. Are we using link communication services? Are we using email services? Or click to run? Or are we down in Azure and using media services? Very, very specific about what service we're using and what type of data is in that service. We then look at the compliance environment. As I said, we're not lawyers. You need to deal with your legal community and your risk community to understand what laws and compliance requirements apply to you. If you're in the content provision, the media world, you have a certain set of rules and regulations that you have to abide by. If you're in the financial services, there are rules and regulations. And so take a look across the board at all those rules and regulations that apply to your particular public sector, health, energy, the variety of different domains. As our services are deployed, we meet many of the standardized compliance requirements, and you need to see how they apply to your particular domain.
And then check those boxes.
Check those boxes. Now, an important part of this is not to start with a blank sheet of paper. It's to look at your current environment. In many cases, you might not be performing to the degree that you think you are. And so we found in some cases when people actually look at their compliance environment, how they're running things, how frequently they do their backups, what type of controls they have in place, their controls might not be as vigorous as they once thought them to be. And so it's important to look at how you run your service today and then to see what the delta would be, the change between your current service and your next service. Compliance
10 years ago was a lot different than compliance today.
Exactly. And you might have shadow IT that's opened up within your environment, of people running services in the back of your environment. People let things slide, so perhaps no loan zones have slipped a little bit since the last audit. So it's really, really important to take a look at where you are today and how you're moving to the future. And we've actually seen customers that have done that review and found that the compliance requirements and the safeguards provided by the cloud actually increase the level of assurance and confidence they have in how the services are provided. We invite customers to do privacy impact assessments and threat risk assessments. So don't go blindly into the cloud. So take a look at your privacy environment, understand what personal data you may or may not control, understand the SLAs of your service provider, look at the threats that are there for your data, and look at the controls that are there.
Shouldn't that be done regardless of whether or not you go into the cloud or not?
It should be done regardless, but sadly, many people leave that by the wayside and simply move very quickly forward. Ideally, you'd already have this documentation in place. So, for example, if you're running an email server within your environment, you should have a privacy impact assessment and a threat risk assessment for that service. And so the change to the system is simply a quick little delta. So what has changed within your system? How have you increased or mitigated the risks? Pilot the service. Many of the services come with free trials.
Yep.
So have a look, kick the tires. Start up a few users on the service and get an understanding of what type of instrumentation you receive, what type of administration portal do you have, how does it integrate with your existing environment.
And the pilot part of it, the part that I like the most is use it for testing, application testing, where you don't have actually real data.
You shouldn't be testing with real data.
You shouldn't be testing with real data, yes, but should and do. But in a sandbox environment in the cloud, do all your testing, your application development, where there's no actually risk of losing that data, and let's get comfortable with using it as a pilot.
You're exactly right, and we've seen as those first workloads to move to the cloud that often customers pick environments where I call it low policy friction, so where there's no consideration or no requirement for handling personal information. So as you said, test and dev, where you're dealing with dummy data and it doesn't really have a compliance aspect to it, hey, that's something that might streamline that journey into the cloud.
Mm-hmm. Or at the very least, help you look at it and see how it would affect the way you're doing things.
Exactly. And one of the things that you'll find is that it may alleviate some of the burdens that your IT staff has had in the past. So as you're able to spin up machines very, very rapidly and take people out of the mundane grunt work of managing a server and the applications that are upon it, they may find more time to be creative and meet the business requirements. Look at the delta. So again, look at the difference between the risk before and after. And we've seen, like I've said in other components here, that many customers have found that the risk has actually decreased by going out to the cloud. They've provided more resilience in their service and greater availability. Look at the SLAs. So that legal agreement, what does Microsoft then commit to from a service level? Is that service level consistent with your expectations? And does it meet the business requirements?
On the service level agreement, though, on the SLA front, I do find that sometimes there's a difference between what people would like to have and what people actually need to have. I've had that conversation not too long ago about somebody who was saying that they provided 5 nines in their own environments. But when I drilled into it a little bit more, didn't have only had like one location.
Right.
So they don't have the capacity to fail over should something happen in that location. So really they're hoping for 5 nines, but the infrastructure to support 5 nines is nowhere there. And I'm not saying that our SLA is 5 nines either. Just look at the documentation.
You're exactly right, and that fits exactly with the third bullet that's there, is look at your current environment. And so, that case that you cited, 5 nines with only one site, I wonder how they do backup and recoveries and the normal administration. It's probably not quite the 5 nines that they're looking for. And it's also a cost for service as well. So the value of moving to public cloud is to be able to have a relatively low cost of service and get great capabilities as part of that service. Mm-hmm. And then finally, it's all about the business case. So this has to make business sense for your organization. You want to meet the business requirements for agility, for time to market, for lower costs, because you're getting out of some of those mundane costs of running the service. It's often been estimated that 70% of the cost of IT goes into just keeping the lights on. So the routine maintenance, updates, just making sure that the big iron is running. If you can take that out of the process, the business case then can become really quite clear.
Or even not even removing it completely, but at least cutting it in half, or I don't know what the real number is, but if you take a chunk of that biggest part of that pie.
That's right. And you can look more broadly across the business. Look at your network service provision. Perhaps you have the ability to look at your facilities costs. Sometimes the IT staff doesn't get to manage the facilities budget, but how much are you spending for floor space, for cooling, heating, and ventilation, and things like that? And then lastly, decide and manage the risk. And this is an important step. Sometimes the people that are doing the risk decision making within an organization might be fairly junior in the organization. And it's not to knock any of you that are senior in managing risk, but the business risk decision needs to come at the line of business and have the line of business decide whether or not cloud meets their business requirements and provides them the capabilities that they expect. And so really this is about managing that risk and deciding whether or not there is comfort in being able to go there.
Yep.
But we know we have choices.
Yes.
And
well, we have choices. We always had choices, but now what the choices are more, what's the word I'm looking for? Mixed
choices and varied.
And right. Varied and combining different choices together to do different things based on what your business units want to do.
You're exactly right. And what we found is that there are a variety of different applications, a variety of different data, and different customizations that are there for making that cloud choice. Again, pointing back to some of those myths, it's not an all or nothing conversation. So as you're looking towards those different opportunities in the cloud, we generally see people starting off with cost. So public cloud is all about economies of scale and being able to provide consistent services to a broad population at low cost. As you get to higher cost services, well, then you get greater capabilities for customization or bespoke type approach. The next axis that's important is the sensitivity of the data. Now, for low sensitive data, perhaps it's marketing information that you're trying to distribute to a broad community. Not a lot of friction there and not a lot of consideration around additional safeguards required for that. If you're dealing with your very sensitive intellectual property, maybe it's your R&D department, maybe that's something that you'd feel more comfortable safeguarding on your premise. And so high sensitivity data.
Customer list with addresses and credit card numbers and all that.
Yeah, the secret sauce, so to speak, of your organization.
Yeah.
And then finally, customization. Is this a very generic commodity service that you're making use of, or is it bespoke? Have you done a lot of customization and built out those communities? And so as we start to look at how the cloud fits in these environments, we find that low cost, low custom, and low sensitive information flows fit on one part of the curve. And as you move up this curve, you find that the costs increase dramatically. So if you have highly sensitive data, lots of customization, it's going to cost you more. So if we were to map out cloud services across this continuum, we see that public cloud fits towards the moderate sensitivity.
Okay.
It allows you to do some configuration and provides you great bang for your buck for the cost equation.
Without compromising any of that sensitive information.
Correct. So you provide those safeguards and allow people to sleep well at night, and it also gives you those appropriate safeguards without having to build additional safeguards on top of the information that's there. As you move up to greater customization requirements and greater sensitivity, we have things like community clouds or local cloud providers, like our Cloud OS network,
yes,
where you have the capability to ask for specific features that fit your particular business. Now, those specific features are going to cost you more. I've said in the past, it's like going to your local sandwich shop and asking for double meat on your sandwich. Well, double meat's going to cost you more. So you can circle the garden and fill up with all the veggies, but if you want those additional capabilities that aren't right for everybody, it's going to cost you a little bit more.
Yeah, that's kind of normal. And just because we are in the Canadian legislative landscape, those community clouds or those Cloud OS partners would be able to host those services within our geography.
Exactly right. So they can host those services within our geography. They're not able to take advantage of the economies of scale that the worldwide cloud providers can do. But you see there's a modest increment in the amount of cost that the cost equation that's there. And then finally, for those highly custom applications, highly sensitive applications, you're going to end up paying more. This is an on-premise solution with the packaged software, with all the hardware, with the staff and manpower, the processes, all the security controls that are there. So when you're talking national secrets type information, so highly sensitive government information, highly sensitive law enforcement information, that's probably in a private cloud type environment. But these clouds can be connected, and so you can pick and mix and take the best advantage of each particular environment.
Yes, there's nothing that stops you from having your publicly accessible website with your cloud presence, your contact us here, here's the brochure of all of our latest products, to have that into the public cloud, but to have that application that deals with ordering and billing being in your private cloud, and so pick and choose what you want and take advantage of where it's appropriate.
Exactly, and that's actually a great place for a segue around the change to the business and the need to have a multidisciplinary approach, a broad cross-business approach to going to the cloud. And so where you've divided up in a hybrid environment and you have certain services externally and certain services internally, that changes the way you do perhaps incident response. And so where there are situations where perhaps a like competitor has data spillage, you might need to be proactive to say, what, we're all okay here. That didn't impact our business. Or to be able to clarify between an externally facing marketing site and an internally facing R&D site. So you need to get the whole organization involved to understand the change in the way that you communicate to your customers. Mm-hmm. So as you make that cloud choice, I mentioned earlier this concept of privacy impact assessment or a Delta privacy impact assessment. And so these are a little bit new on the marketplace. We've seen them traditionally in government circles where the data protection authorities have asked governments or demanded governments to provide privacy impact assessments. But it really is all about the data. It's all about how do you categorize the data? What are those controls you have in place to recognize the difference between normal inter-office communications and communications that deal with personal information? And do you have those delineations in place? What type of sensitivity levels? Do you have controls? What type of data loss prevention tools? there's a variety of different conversations and discussion items that you can consider as you look at doing that privacy impact assessment. And so here I've listed a few of them that come top of mind around helping line of business owners understand some of those considerations, how they need to put in place strong privacy programs, and as well then to pass those questions on to their provider.
Yeah, and this is just a subset of those questions, depending on which requirements you have that your legal department that you've already brought to the table, right? They'll tell you that there may be additional questions that you need answered in order to put those checkbox.
Exactly right, and I think the first one is paramount. Does your business retain ownership of its data? And as we've gone through the other modules, it's something that we are staunch advocates for. That it's always your data, and that you should be asked for that data and not ourselves. How do your cloud service providers handle government requests? And we covered, that we thwart those requests or fight those requests in the courts where gag orders are put in. We fight cybercrime. So these questions are sound questions to ask your cloud provider to make sure that you are safeguarding your data in the best way possible.
Yep. And some of those questions should be asked internally as well, even if you're not putting your data on cloud providers, because you should be able to know how is our company protecting ourselves from cybercrime? How are we protecting ourselves from failure? Are we doing replication? Where is our data being stored? Do we have backup copies? So I think a privacy assessment should be looked at regardless whether or not you're going to the cloud or not.
Exactly right. And for those businesses that are doing providing services internationally, moving to the cloud can often give them a head start to meeting compliance requirements around the world. As I mentioned, Microsoft builds out our worldwide cloud services informed by local policies. And so many cases, you might find that your compliance obligations in a different region are met by simply moving to the Microsoft cloud.
Yeah, and what about the usage of that data?
Well, that's an important aspect that needs to enter into the conversation about how your cloud provider uses the data. What is their business model and how they will administer that service that they provide. And we've seen some businesses that made their livelihood around the repurposing of data. So scanning, analyzing data to get analytics out of it, and then using third-party usage of that data. And sometimes people don't realize that that's the case. And so really we recommend that IT pros, the compliance people, the line of business, understand how that organization monetizes their services and how they handle the data that they administer. And so, in the Microsoft environment, our enterprise cloud services don't share data with our advertiser-supported services. We don't mine customer data for advertising. And I think that's an important thing that helps the CEO sleep at night.
Well, that's one thing. I think it's important for everybody to realize is that if that's just part of your risk and you know that that data is being used for other reasons and you're okay with that, then you've accepted the risk and you move on. That goes back to what we were talking about last modules in risk assessment.
That's right, but I'm not sure I'd be comfortable having other people go through all my corporate information. So
I'm not the one deciding.
You're exactly right. You're exactly right. So after we go through kind of the legislative environment, that compliance environment, we've done the threat risk assessment. Let's do a double click and see how those services are actually provided, right? And so I think when we start to look at how Microsoft provides their cloud services, we've talked about this idea of defense in depth, end-to-end security, and it's something that we really take seriously. So we go all the way from the facility, all the way up through the data and security management. And so it starts right at the perimeter of our facilities, making sure we have man traps and vehicle traps so that you can't simply drive in like a crazy person into the facility and do a denial of service attack. We have data centers within data centers, no loan zones, least privileges, a whole bunch of perimeter defense, internal defenses, host defenses, you name the safeguards, we've applied them in a number of different places. It's really quite something to see the different controls as they work in concert with one another across the environment to be able to provide that strong assurance in compliance with industry standards and in many cases going above and beyond. If we were to dive deeper into them, we can look at the physical data center security, so perimeter, building, computer rooms, no loan zones, the access requests for those areas where people are allowed to tour, the fencing. So very, very high-grade protections that go across the board to, again, ensure that your information is safe from a physical perspective.
It's funny because I did well, they called that a tour. It was more like we drove on the bus by the data center and somebody pointed out the window and said, and that's the data center. That's as close as we could get to it.
Really, yeah, it's really quite astounding to really take it seriously about all the controls that are there. As a Microsoft employee, I had a badge that expired at a certain time. I was only allowed in certain areas, and we were escorted by a number of people so that we didn't wander off. And there were places where I was not permitted to have physical access to because I did not have that need to know and need to access. Included within the security techniques, I pull out one. We could talk all afternoon about all the different controls, each of those different layers, and be very, very specific about each of the controls. But one of the things that's part of the way that we do our business is providing that trustworthy foundation. I talked about the security development lifecycle of how it builds into our environment. So one of the things we do is we build in all these safeguards, all these controls to make sure that security and privacy are maintained. So threat modeling, code review, we do fuzz testing, security testing, all those types of things. And then we have a team that comes in and they basically wipe the slate. And they say, you know what? All that didn't work. Assume that you've been hacked. And so that puts us in a whole different perspective to say, okay.
Go from defensive to offensive.
Well, to try to figure out, so if those all fail, how do we then, what information then is exposed? And it allows us to think differently about some of the safeguards. And so it includes techniques like data minimization, compartmentalization to make sure that, hey, we limit that exposure should that ever happen, and even though it's been designed not to happen. And so building that mindset into the tools really then mitigates the risk. Sometimes people believe that, of cascading type exploits. So what happens if somebody puts a virtual machine onto an Azure instance and that machine isn't appropriately patched or safeguarded?
Yep.
How do you make sure it doesn't cascade across? Well, assuming breach and putting in all the other controls and boundaries, make sure that what happens in one environment because of malconfiguration by a customer doesn't cascade across the whole domain.
So tenant A, if he doesn't take care of his machines and he doesn't do his patching properly on all of those VMs, gets infected, gets compromised in some way, won't affect tenant B.
Correct. And what we can do is we can help tenant A recover. So if there's something that happens, let's say they get infected with a botnet that starts streaming spam, we notice that through our network analysis tools and say, you know what, here's something that's gone awry, let's help them shut it down. So we were able to do that, and that's just one of the features. Again, we could spend all afternoon looking through each individual feature about how security is provided, but I thought that one was particularly important to our audience because that often comes up around, how do I make sure that what help happens to someone else doesn't impact the whole environment?
Yep. And all of that, I was about to say, is completely transparent.
I beat you to it with
the
clicker click. So it's all transparent, and we try to provide information in a meaningful fashion, in a transparent fashion as much as we can to our customers. And that means putting the information out there on the web so that people have ready access to it when and where they require it. That includes our third-party verifications of our many different audits, providing access to audit reports and compliance. We actually share out our best practices and guidance so that if you want to operate our software in a private cloud environment, you can use our cookbooks in order to do so. And our Cloud OS partners take advantage of those cookbooks as they deploy their services locally in their environment. We work together with industry associations like the Cloud Security Alliance and their STAR assessment tool to make sure that we're keeping abreast of the state of the art for security and being able to report on that.
So we're making sure that other entities that do scan and that do compliance checking, that we meet their standards and extra.
That's right. And there are so many different compliance requirements and local compliance requirements around the world. So we can't pick and choose 10,000 of them. But what we do is we pick and choose those that are most prominent in the marketplace. And the Cloud Security Alliance has really bubbled up as one of them. We also have the International Standardization Organization, the SSAE 16 audit requirements, HIPAA, the GLBA compliance. So we have a number of different requirements that our customers have asked for and that our customers require.
Okay.
What we try to do is simplify that by providing those controls and guidance out there.
I was about to say, for an IT pro who's looking at that and getting all these acronyms, sometimes you need to be able to simplify that in a way that you can present it back to management when they ask about, hey, if we want to do this, if we want to move to cloud computing, what do we need to know in terms of compliance?
Right, and all these compliance requirements are simply a set of controls. So think of them as safeguards and processes and practices that are put in place to make sure that you have an environment that's trustworthy. So from a privacy perspective, a security perspective, and a reliability perspective. So they add that repeatability into the process. And as you start to go through some of the requirements and see the controls that are in place, they'll be very familiar to you as an IT professional. Things like change management processes, update management process, personnel clearances and access controls, things like that. They'll be second nature to the way that you run your business today.
Yep. And as you can see in the list under like government industry certification, these are not necessarily Canadian specific. These are worldwide.
Exactly.
But most of those are stringent enough that they cover everything we have as well.
In many cases, sometimes there's a little bit of a mapping that needs to be done. In some cases, it's directly applicable. So the payment card industry and their standards apply to Canadian financial institutions in the payment card industry here. For the U.S. government, Federal Information Systems standards that are listed at the top. The Canadian government has adopted the technical standards that are developed by the U.S. government. So all they did was change a few of the Z's to S's to deal with the difference in the language. But they're fundamentally the same documents. And so you'll find there's a great affinity or alignment between those different standards, and they have great worth in other nations.
And of course, if we haven't told you already, you got to get your own set of lawyers to look at those and give you the interpretation of what those legislation and compliance requirements are for your own environment.
Exactly, and what we've done is we made it easy for them to find out all this information and get a sense of where and how we do our business. And so the Azure Trust Center, the Office 365 Center, Trust Center provide one-stop shop for security, privacy, compliance, provides the documentation around our service level agreements, what our commitments are for privacy, our privacy policy, our incident response policy. So all those things that organizations would be interested in as they look to move to the cloud and transform how they provide their IT services and their business more generally.
So now we've talked about the myths, the misconception, the risk, the confidence, the privacy, the compliance and legislation. So where do we go from there? Like where's our IT folks and our CXOs or all these people out there that are looking or thinking about going to the cloud? What is their next step?
I try to keep it simple. I try not to give people a variety of things to do. So I think there's three things that people can look to do. I think the first thing is help demystify the cloud for your organization. So scratch the surface, look at that Swiss Army knife of capabilities, and look at what capability can really help your business.
Or point your management to this recording.
If you think that will help,
that may be just the first step.
It might be the first step to help demystify and understand the differences there. I think the second step is look at specific workloads. So dev test you mentioned was one of them.
Low-hanging fruits.
Low-hanging fruits. Maybe it's a collaboration site, a file sharing site. And to look at those from a business capability. So what business capability could benefit from the cloud, from that scalability, that easy access, the seasonal demand. So things like that. We've seen some organizations move very, very quickly where there's low policy friction. And so not doing business in the first instance where they're dealing with the highly sensitive information.
Or even like my friends in South America that are only using Azure for the networking, the virtual networking portion of it. They're using it, so they're not storing actually any workloads in it, but they're using it as a branch office in the cloud to get people to connect to it, and then piggyback on that to where the data is, which is on-premise.
That's exactly right. And these two first items kind of work hand in hand. As you think about the workload, it demystifies the cloud. And it's often what happens is some of these objections around compliance disappear because, as you said, there's no particular compliance need around the particular service or the data that's handled. I think the last piece, which is perhaps one of the most important pieces with this, is as you work with the team across your business, is seek advice about your compliance requirements. Your business is unique. You have a unique environment in which you operate, and so it's important that you understand all the compliance requirements that apply to you. They may be different from one sector to another sector, and so have that conversation with your legal team and your risk team so that you can go in with your eyes open and your head up and be confident in that move to the cloud.
So let me play a little bit of a devil's advocate thing here, because every other week I'm on the road and I'm meeting IT pros and I say, hey, have you guys moved anything to the cloud? Are you looking at it? And they say, no, we've been told that we have legal requirement to not use the cloud. So if the IT folks are going and asking their lawyers or their legal groups, is there something we should recommend? Like if somebody says, no, you can't, what's the next step?
I think the next step, the best next step is to talk with the business owners. So the line of business operators, because they stand to benefit the most from the way that the business is provided. So business environment is changing. We've all seen it happening around us. It's the fastest time to market. It's the most agile. It's those most dynamic to the customer demands. And the customer demand might be the enterprise employees. It might be your external customers. And so having a dynamic business is critical to success today. And so your best advocate in working with the legal community, and it's not us versus them discussion, it's to work together, is that line of business owner to say, hey, I can make your life easier, better, faster through the use of cloud services. Let's go have a conversation together with our compliance team and see how we can do it and how fast we can do it.
Again, it's like, what are you going to put on there? Is it subject to some requirements and compliance and legislation? And based on that, you figure out what to put in place to protect it.
And you might need a little bit of tenacity. You might need to come back again and again and just, be persistent in those conversations and the questions that you ask. And, often I find it's useful as, can you show me where that is? Can you help me understand a little bit better where that is? And that often breaks down the barriers between IT and legal, who, let's face it, sometimes we speak a different language. Well,
there you have it, folks. Demystifying the Azure, having confidence in the cloud for IT professionals. It's not just for IT professionals, it's for any business person as well. So I hope this was valuable to you. We always look for feedback, so leave us some feedback. Contact us on canitpro.net. And if you have some questions or some scenarios, and hopefully you've gotten enough information out of the last 4 modules to help you in your travels to the cloud.
In your journey to the cloud.
The journey to the cloud. So on that note, thank you very much for spending the time with us.
Thank you.
I'm Pierre Roman.
And I'm John Weigelt.
Have a good day.